It's in the nature of an Ocamper conference that you hear a variety of different ideas on a variety of topics. And it becomes, at the end of 2 days plus, that's a lot of information to take in. And I have found that when I attend the conference, there are things that strike me, that I learn that in the talk, that stay with me. And then there are things that strike me in the opposite direction, like that I'm not sure I entirely agree with, that I have more questions about. And in a perfect world, we would be able to all sit in groups of 3 or 4 over coffee with each of the presenters and have in-depth conversations. In lieu of that, we have an opportunity now to ask you to reflect on this weekend. What are the things that really struck you, that jumped out at you, that you are going to take home with you, and would you be willing to share that? And is there something that struck you that maybe raised a question that you might want to ask right now from our panelists? Because when we allow this process, then we see the things that touched different people, and it allows us to have a kind of a debriefing, a processing, a settling in of all the information. So at this point, I would like to open it up. What did strike you? Is there something you heard that you said, you know, that really explains something I might have known, but it was said in a way that really clarified things for me, related to the topics, related to our vocations, related to our faith, or any questions you might have of our panelists? I'm going to begin if nobody does. So what struck me, and every plenary speaker brought something really beautiful to the table, but I want to ask Dr. Papadopoulos, when he spoke about his work and his ministry, you spoke about confronting this evil, and you described your experience of just joining these people who've been victimized or experienced horrible things. And you described your understanding that in the middle of all these horrible things, there are actually some positive aspects. And you described it beautifully. You had a beautiful chart that nicely laid it out. And you presented it so eloquently, if I may say. You made it seem easy. And you even said, if I recall, anyone can do this. My question that I have for you is, I don't believe that. Because I think something happens in that it's like a fire that you enter into with someone. And how do we acquire the capacity to face that, to draw close to someone who has gone through what we've gone through? And you nicely described that in your brain, this was what you were thinking too. Well, how do I do this? How do we acquire that capacity? Or maybe the word is, how do we acquire that love? How do we learn this? Because I think we all desire this. How do we learn that?
Yes, because I'm quite small, I better stand up. Thank you. Well, I really mean what I said, that this is not magic and anybody can do it. Of course, given certain preconditions. And the preconditions perhaps may be these. To begin with, to have the framework that I outlined, which is the framework that when we are looking at damage, we must also look not only at damage, but also what are the existing strengths of that person, and also what has that adversity taught that person. That's a wisdom that all of us have in all cultures, in all languages, exists. There are variations of the saying, whatever doesn't kill you strengthens you, and that's a reality. In other words, everybody when they experience any form of adversity, something happens in them, because our usual, that's what adversity means, adversus, against what we expect, taking the opposite turn of the events that we had planned. Then we pause and we say, well, now then, what? I was planning my life, all of us here things, variations of this. I was planning my life in a certain way, and this has happened, and now I'm lost. Yes, okay, yeah, that's right. So what we had planned has come to an end. Now what? So that always presupposes a potential new direction. But when people are focusing exclusively on the loss, they do not see that in addition to, not instead of, there is also an opportunity for a new direction. People say, because I've come so close to death, because I lost so many things, now I'm wondering, what is life about? Shall I carry on working long hours and not meeting my family, and in order to buy a boat or something, or a holiday, etc.? Or should I be focusing on something else? In other words, people come to crucial turning points in their lives that, dare I say, existential or spiritual points of view begin to emerge in a way that they didn't emerge before. We know that that's a fact. The question is, how do we use these? Are we aware of them, or do we get into the mode of the societal discourse of trauma, so to speak, that focuses exclusively on the damagedness and puts us as experts to fix the damage? Yes, we're there to fix the damage, but if we don't look at the totality of that person, never mind looking at that human being as the image and likeness of God, in other words, with incredible potential. We know from we don't need spiritual discourses to look at human beings and organisms as self-preserving and self-developing organisms. So if we don't look at the totality and we're just focusing only on the damage, and we put ourselves only as fixers of the damage, then of course we will not be aware of that possibility, and we cannot convey that possibility to others. But if we are aware, following, for example, that the grid that the framework that I've developed over the years, it helps us look at the damage, also appreciate that that person, regardless of whatever damage they have experienced, they have retained some strengths, and it's up to us to discern them, because at that time when it hurts, they do not think of that. And also, what have they learned and what have they grown as a result of that? And once you have this kind of three-dimensionality as a framework for you, of course you will respond to the pain and the suffering and the damage, but also you will keep in mind the other sides. And that is a question of practice, really. So if people have that kind of framework with practice, I really mean it. It doesn't require any kind of superhuman qualities. It's just a question of training, that we see the totality of a person with the other dimensions, and in that way it is possible then to activate all the other dimensions in addition to the damageness. And the adversity-activated development is actually quite substantial in every situation. And I really challenge anybody, in every situation, somebody does learn something. I work with severely traumatized people, with severely tortured people, and all of that. Just the fact that they say, my goodness, I never thought that I was so strong to have survived all those tortures. That is a new input in their understanding of themselves. So it's a question of us systematizing that. That's why I'm talking about epistemology. What do we see in front of us? Do we see a damaged person, or do we see a person who, yes, has been damaged, but also has retained something as well as has gained something? And if we have that as a framework, it's not impossible to act in a way that we actualize all three. We address all these three dimensions. Thank you.
This is the auditorium.
So look, I have a question for anybody that wants to answer it. I mean, one of the things that I thought about between this sort of idea of resistance and compliance is vulnerability. That what happens is the person who goes into the physician's office, into the therapist's office, or goes to the monastery for advice, they're in a vulnerable position. Because if they get the wrong advice, if they get the wrong treatment, then they are the ones who are going to suffer for it and have problems. And I think that part of the reason why we see resistance is because of this vulnerability position that people find themselves into. And I guess I'd just like somebody to reflect upon that vulnerability aspect.
The icon of the paralytic that was on, I think, Ioana's slide really captured that for me. Imagine not being able to break your fall and trusting your friends on ropes, handmade ropes, unsophisticated, to be lowered from a roof. What kind of faith that expresses. I just empathetically really can't imagine how to overcome such a fear, and to see such trust and cooperation. But when we see the doctors, we could only lose our lives, and when we have others, spiritual life is more serious than that. But still, to trust God to take care of us somehow, the best we can do. So we can only do the best that we can do.
Father Legelet has a comment somewhere where he says that there was a cross in the heart of God before there was one outside the gates of Jerusalem. So one reflection is that surely God knew that to create an other, creation itself, and then certainly humanity, with the possibility of becoming person by responding to divine love, that this would involve immense suffering. So the cross is part of the recognition of God's willingness to offer life. I'm thinking, Gail, of what you were asking, in spite of knowing that you'll be hurt repeatedly. And in a sense, throughout all of history, for all of time, there'll be that. And even, I don't know what the agony is of never giving up eternally on love of someone that you can't, that chooses against you. And how many families feel this with children, that they can't, no matter how much they pray, no matter how much they love, the children are unable to respond to that. So, throughout life, like a hologram, this same question that you've posed, Gail, is everywhere, in lost loves and death. So I think that this is sort of the other part of the call and response of the divine to the creation. We're flung into life, and this is certainly a condition we didn't create, so we don't have any choice about that. But now we are potentially response-able for that miracle. What will our answer be? God's gift is, I love you totally with my entire life, and the way to me will be in returning that, and it will have to go through the cross. So we are contending with this question all throughout our life, with every loss, with every futility, everything we bump up against that doesn't go the way we want. And most especially, I think, from the moment of conception, we have a cross. And we have a cross in innocence because people are innocent at conception. And yet, proleptically, throughout a life, to our last breath, we will be discovering a presence that was there that we didn't even know about and can't even comprehend, maybe for 50 years or 60 years, that helps us forgive that and see if we will move from the compulsive adaptations that we make to protect ourselves, consciously and unconsciously as children, to the freely chosen cross that Christ takes. No one takes my life from me, he says. Freely I give it. We first have a compulsive cross. All the characterological adaptations, everything that our body does to heal, the scabs, the wounds, the inflammations, the psychic things, all of this is an attempt of life to preserve itself, but it hasn't yet moved to the transformative event that comes through communion with the divine, which involves that portal of the cross. So I think you've asked Gail a question central to what human existence is. And just like Christ was a person of grief, so are we. But grief is the other side of joy and of gratefulness and of speechlessness before the thatness of the gift of our being.
This dovetails with some of what Father Deacon is saying here. When Gail first brought up the question of vulnerability, I heard in that the dynamic of the person who is facing the person of authority feels vulnerable and weak and therefore hesitates, resists. And I thought the most vulnerable is a little infant, and of course our God became vulnerable for us when he became a little infant. And then of course you referenced the cross, where he is the most vulnerable of all. And I thought the way in which we can navigate the power dynamic is to think of ourselves as imitating Christ in being vulnerable before those that we obey or we approach, but then the other way around too, that those who stand in the place of being obeyed and the person perhaps anxious, resistant, vulnerable, is Christ himself. We look at this vulnerable person as our Lord became weak and vulnerable for us. And then that whole power dynamic shifts and becomes that relationship of love that enables the two to benefit from one another as opposed to being opposed to one another.
Again, I would like to say something about the vulnerability that the societal discourse on expert and on mental health care rewards that, and we should be aware of that. In other words, there is a trap there. Not only in terms of humanitarian help, but in terms of any other kind of help, we need to sort of waive our vulnerability in order to get attention, in order to get help. So that's something that is rewarded. And of course, people have some vulnerabilities in order to, because of whatever situations, and they seek attention and they seek help. Fine. The question then is for us, and I'm going back to my epistemological agility, to see that they have some vulnerability in relation to certain contexts and not to see them as vulnerable. In other words, I make a distinction, and I urge to consider this, making a distinction between a person being vulnerable in relation to certain events and circumstances as opposed to a person being vulnerable. In other words, the identity of victim as opposed to a person being victimized by an earthquake, torture, by illness, by this and that and that and that. And usually, in terms of our language, we don't make that distinction, and we fall into the trap, all of us. And of course, rewarded by the system of care, health care, and all kind of assistance. Think about it. It rewards only the persons who are vulnerable. So there is a paradox if you really think about it epistemologically. On the one hand, as healthcare providers, we're there to certify the vulnerability, and then at the same time, and confirm it, and at the same time, heal it. That's a bit of a paradox. We can do that once we see its relative existence in the context and in its relative nature in the context of vulnerability in relation to something, and under, it's sort of something within certain contexts, certain time scales, etc., etc., etc. But that differentiation is not made easily by us and by our language and by our healthcare systems.
I would like to come back to Reno's previous comment at the beginning about the tendency to see the totality of a person. I think this is a general practice and a very good advice that we all use, and we need to use both at schools and as educators and as parents. And whenever parents come and complain about their children, a very good advice that I think it always works is to tell the parents, try and find something positive that your child has. And this really works. And I wanted to emphasize this because we all speak about the total development of the children, but in practice we don't do it. And a second thing, again, Renos mentioned the proverb which says, what doesn't kill you, it strengthens you. And my question is, yes, what is it exactly that strengthens us during difficult situations in life? Is it our human nature? Is it God? Or is both? Thank you.
Yes. Well, about these strengths, I must be very clear that I don't particularly like the idea of strengths-based approach, because there is also weaknesses. And what I'm talking about is the totality, how we can look at the weaknesses in the context of strengths. But the idea that usually people say, oh, look at the bright side, or there is a silver lining, or look at the strengths and all of that, ignoring the pain and the suffering, I don't particularly think that is very useful. So the art and the epistemological agility is how to look at the one and the other rather than one instead of the other. And usually in under emotional pressures of these difficult situations of adversity, we oversimplify things and we polarize things, and we cannot see end, but we see either or. And we see people either vulnerable or resilient. Vulnerable, but every human being is vulnerable in the context of certain things and resilient in the context of other things. and seeing that kind of complexity, that's why usually I sort of rhetorically I say the first casualty of adversity is complexity. We lose complexity, so we cannot see end. That's the first thing I want to say. In terms of what emerges then to give us strength, well, yes, in a sense, biologically, human beings are miracles. We're more sophisticated than any machine and anything that human beings can devise. I mean, it's a remarkable miracle that human beings are. We forget that. We take it for granted. And then, of course, yes, as Orthodox, we know that we are, and we believe and we pray to live up to the fact that we're, the image and likeness of God. So, where it's coming from, everybody should sort of pray to feel the real source, where it's coming from.
What has become clear for me during these days is that there's a variety of resistances, and of course there are bad resistances in terms of human freedom. So people are free to resist to God and His commandments, as well as resist to health recommendations or whatever. So, on one hand, we have to invent ways to overcome those bad resistances, both clergy and helping professions. But there is another group of resistances which were called helping today, and for them, I think we should be grateful, both the church and the helping professions. Why? Because they are the indicators of the systemic problems and diseases of the church or medicine or psychology. Like the same way when there is a systemic disease in the family and the child becomes the most vulnerable member and presents symptomatology, and then just judging superficially, one could say, oh, this is the problematic member of the family, but we know that the child is just the symptom of the disease. The same with those resistances. I have met people who have abandoned the church, and in their negation to be Christians, they are healthier than other Christians who keep being in the church. And there was a Greek priest who told me once, if I was a lay person, I would not attend liturgy in my parish. The same with medicine. I mean, this human veterinary, as it's called, I read it somewhere, what Father Stephen described as depersonalization and detachment. This has triggered, how to say, a rebellion against classic medicine, a neglect of health in the name of resistance. It has been an ideological flag for some people, and it's very dangerous for their health, of course, but I'm not sure that physicians have gotten the message to change their medicine. The same, for example, with psychiatry, psychology. So I think that for this healthy wing of resistance, we need to receive it with gratitude and examine ourselves and exert self-critique and change, systemic change. Otherwise, the problem will be worse in the future, and it's very bad for people, both for their spiritual health and mental and physical health. Thank you.
I was just going to say that one of the books that I quoted, thought it was interesting that the title was Why We Revolt. speaking to the patient's experience of medical care. And so that is a reflection of what Father just said. Again, I kind of feel like I have been blessed to practice medicine in kind of a rarefied environment, and probably with my Orthodox lens. But I know that all, what we've been speaking of, and the sort of the corporate medical model and all of that can certainly rob society of personhood. And we all just, again, become the case and become the lab test that we treat. So,
Just say.
What you were describing as positive resistance, I was describing as obedience to the higher truth. And I can't help but think, where would we be without the martyrs, every one of whom resisted? And the health of the church really is dependent a lot on people continually seeking to obey Christ in the highest, deepest, purest form, and not to settle for lesser truths or distortions of the truth. So that's the way I would see the positive resistance within the life of the church. But certainly the martyrs are the example of that, I would say.
Just to follow up on that, an added thought of that is that I would look at that as that was a conscious choice, a resistance that comes from being obedient to Christ. There's another, I don't know if Father Vasilius was referring to this, but I think of another form that's more of an unconscious response that can be healthy, but it conceals something that's not yet to consciousness, that is being, like an early example would be a child that's 4 years old who lies to their mother about something. Discovers that their mother's mind and their mind are different. So the lie has a different, it's a lie, but it's actually something they have to do to gain the ability to differentiate. So that's an early developmental one. And I think there are things that come along later, like teenage rebellion, lots of things that they're uncomfortable, but they're basically healthy, but they're not fully conscious yet. Whereas the martyrs have reached a stage where their resistance is a function of saying yes mightily to God, and they're willing to pay the utmost price. There's another form of resistance that isn't conscious, but is developmentally seems to be necessary. And it's a mixture of acting out, if you want to put it that way in some sense. But I look at it as something is trying to make itself conscious, and it's not yet known. So if that can be approached seeing deeper than just, oh, this was a bad thing, we got to stop, but look at what is trying to be heard here that's not yet, then we get another possibility.
Can I just add to that some of what we see as resistance or rebellion, especially among young people, against certain teachings of the church, is really that struggle with trying to understand the truths that they know intuitively, the presence of God, and the sense of justice and the sense of what is good, but now trying to conform it to the problem of pain, suffering, injustice that they see. And so their cry against God, which looks like rebellion against God, comes from a legitimate developmental process of trying to understand these deeper issues. And we shouldn't be so quick to say, wrong, 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 but more to see them in the process of coming to that place where they really can faithfully trust in God after having asked these tough questions.
And that's of great value to us personally in the church because we have to reformulate things. And so that question, if you just don't obey and comply, but you raise a question, I have to respond. This is interesting because in some monasteries, because the abbot has absolute authority in many cases, the monks, they wouldn't question that. They would see that as part of the ethos that they have to go along with. And yet, one of the speakers mentioned nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, which is something that's not really a patristic idea, and yet a monastery that runs with an absolute kind of hierarchical authority that doesn't develop brotherhood among its people is operating in a different way than one that where the abbot might say, so brother so-and-so got, he threw the shovel at me. Okay. Does the abbot listen to both sides? Does he hear something of what the felt sense of the person is so that there's a development of relationality? Or is emotion simply disregarded as something not necessary and you should simply obey? So you have a wide range that this happens within the monastic community, and then outside of that you get that in families where you have an enmeshed family or you have a family that's so disengaged that both of these produce pathologies. Health is somewhere in the middle. So to me, this also, we're teasing around something that I think deserves to be developed more, which is within the authority and the hierarchy of the church. We know healthy obedience has humility and joy to it, and it also has a relationality. It may not be consciously or deliberately developed in that way within the monastic community, but perhaps it should be in some way. Perhaps this is a way that psychology has something to offer in terms of empathy, and this is, well, I won't go there. Let's stop there.
Just one more thing. One thing I've come to understand is that doubt, we could say resistance, but questioning, doubt, is part of the process of faith. We shouldn't see them as in opposition. We should see the one as essential to the process of growing in the faith.
I'm just thinking of that short parable, right? That there was a landowner who asked his son to go to the vineyard to work, and he said, "I will go," and he did not. And then he asked the other son, "Go and work," and he said, "I will not go," and he went. So what does it mean in reference to the to compliance and resistance in spiritual life? To me, it says us many things about the difference of the overt willingness and the latent reluctance and the reverse. To me, it says that there are Christians who don't know it, and there are others who have the illusion that they are Christians. I don't know if this parable can be applied in other contexts, in the helping professions, but it's just an indication that the issue is very complex, what compliance and resistance is. And we need to examine ourselves individually and collectively to see if we really comply or resist with God or with the spirit of our profession. Yeah, thank you.
So I have a question. It seems to me, how else does a child learn unconditional love except through resistance? Only do you know your parents love you when you tell them, "I hate you," and then they respond in love. Otherwise, it remains an idea. So there seems to be an essential nature of resistance. Like you can't really say yes until you can say no, and you can say no until you say no and you had the freedom to say no. What are you more concerned about in your work? When you have a compliant patient, student, or when you have a resistant one? Which one is more alarming?
But developmentally, resistance is an organizer of mental life. And not only the child's resistance, the mother's resistance. As the child grows up, mother should not gratify any desire. So it's an organizer around which growing and maturity develop.
The mother's resistance to indulging is part of the process, or the mother's resistance to reacting. What concerns you more, a compliant student, patient, or client, or a resistant one?
A resistance that is eventually convinced.
A resistance that eventually submits.
I really think there's a balance, and I tried to kind of speak about physiologically the balance in our bodies. I think there's a balance between compliance and resistance, and I do worry when I get the patient, it's usually the 85-year-old, who puts everything in my lap, and it's not clear what they should do. There's 5 different ways to go about it, and I try to get them to engage in the conversation. So it's disturbing to just have it all in my lap, and I try to get some sense of their direction and how they're looking at things.
Sometimes there's more of an honesty in resistance than compliance. Like we can't be sure with compliance. With resistance, there's almost a more integrity there, authenticity.
Yeah, you can respond to it.
And you can, it's something to respond to. If there's no other, there's no relationship.
Yeah.
Well, and science proceeds by resistance. The null hypothesis. You have to resist the conclusion that you're looking for, because if you go for what you're looking for, you find it, in a sense, without having really discovered something.
Just speak into the microphone.
In thinking about compliance and resistance, we've spoken in many terms about, as a provider, we want compliance from our clients, patients, what have you. What about as professionals, our compliance or resistance with the larger culture as a whole that may not come together with our orthodox mindset, and how we face as providers our own compliance or resistance with our professional culture around us?
No.
The 2 things that I would think about is, first, my understanding of self as an Orthodox Christian who is in some kind of practice, and secondly, as I think I lost my second half, the contract that we have with the person that we're trying to support and help. So perhaps we can help them explore different ways of understanding the situation so that they can make a free choice, but not shy away from including the truth with the other concepts that are taught and out there.
All right, I have a confession. My mind wandered and I missed half your question, so I can't respond. Please, if you would repeat it.
It was to the effect of our professional culture around us is often at odds with what we know to be true as Orthodox Christians. And so how we assimilate or our own within us compliance and resistance, what from our professional culture versus what we know to be true from our Orthodox faith. So it's our internal compliance and resistance.
I thought that was maybe what you asked. I didn't want to risk it. Just speaking personally, so I've been at this not-for-profit agency for 27 years now, and I moved from 11 years as a pastor into that, so into a clinical setting. And what I'm finding is that in spite of what managed care is requiring and behavioral charts and all the things that we have to do, or treatment plan reviews and that sort of thing, I'm more an orthodox pastoral caregiver priest in my setting than I am a clinician, in the terms that what I'm doing is I'm being with people, loving them, anointing them. Most of the people I see aren't Orthodox. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in a sense. Although, well, I can't say that. I take that back. I see so many clergy that are. That's a different situation. But in our setting, the Bible Belt, they're not Orthodox. So the readings that might be used, my office has probably 15 icons. There's incense in the air from the morning. So oddly, I mean, I've moved so far away from the clinical theories are there, like optometry lenses. I rarely have to deal with the insurance companies. They don't stop me from treating people. I've seen people 350 times and never had to make a case for why I have to continue. So in spite of all the anxiety that runs around about this sort of stuff, for 27 years it hasn't changed much of what I do, except I've watched myself go deeper into what I understand of orthodoxy and ascetical psychology, and that's what I offer people. But not in a didactic sort of way. It's informing my life. So I approach it a little sort of like what Renos has spoken about, open to what their suffering is, help them look at this and find the meaning in their life. So in that sense, I would say personally, it hasn't affected me much. However, my community is in a place like this. I don't find it at MFT. I don't even find it anymore with AAPC, the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, which has moved so far away from Christian integration. So this is very important to support me personally, as to have the community of people that I find here and that I stay in contact with over the year. So I guess what I'm saying is it's an interesting reflection. There's a lot of anxiety. Oh, we got to fulfill this accrediting body, all this stuff, and we do it. But it doesn't determine what we do. What determines what we do is our life, is my life in Christ. That's the only thing I really have to offer. Informed by psychological theory.
This area is contagious in a way. As soon as I sat here, my appetite started. I don't know if it makes sense, but this question reminded me of a chapter written by Archbishop Demetrios in a collected volume. In this, he deals with St. Paul's saying, with Jews I became a Jew, with the pagans I became a pagan, to help everyone be saved. So he's wondering, how can one simulate himself with the other so divergent realities? And he replies that this is possible if we are willing to discover the Jew inside us, or the pagan inside us, or whatever you may fill the gaps according to the context and the culture. So, for example, while preparing a sermon, I have to be honest enough to tell myself, no, abandon this, this is foolish. What about this? No, this is unacceptable. I have to challenge myself and articulate something that could touch me if I could hear it from another preacher. The same with physicians. When I had my heart surgery 2 years ago, I realized how the first seconds that the physician enters the room, or you enter his room, are magnified and become an age. The first seconds of his words and the way he looks at you. So this is something that we have to, all the time we have to put ourselves in the place of the other, which is kenosis, is condensation, just as Christ did.
Thank you. Anything else? Final question?
It's not a question, you're off the hook.
Huh.
This is my first year coming to O'Camper on a whim, just a couple of weeks ago decided. And it's been a wonderful experience, and I am so grateful. And I just wanted to share some of the, what I call gems that I've learned in the last couple of days. And I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work with really complicated couples. And some of this is not new to me, but it just really drove home to me. Trust in the relationship is vital to client adherence. Receive my clients with humility and love. Discern the strengths of my clients and empower them to action. Faith, as small as a mustard seed, can move mountains. My little faith, on behalf of my clients, can change, heal, and move the impossible. I join Christ in the yoke for my clients who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. I might be the only glimpse of Christ that my clients may ever see. When I am truly present, He is also. All of my clients are children of God and deserve dignity, respect, and a safe space to speak, and speak all they want so that I can speak less. There is healing through suffering. Thank you.
Thank you to all who attended this weekend. Thank you, Father, your grace, Dr., Deacon, Doctor, and Doctor. Thank you for your contributions, your presence, your participations, your self-offerings in the workshops, in the sessions, and with us. We wish you all a safe journey home, and we look forward to seeing everyone in Chicago next year. At this point, we are going to the chapel where we have Vespers, and at the end of the Vespers, we have a special prayer for the laying on of hands that we will read that is a little tradition of the O'Camper Conference. So we can wrap up now. Vespers is at 5:30 down the path at the church, followed by a little prayer for laying on of hands. Have a beautiful rest of your evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.